the white list that you referenced, is that, and this may be a really simplistic way of putting this, but is that an attempt by the Chinese government to placate the workers, to placate their population, and to keep factories open?
It is an attempt to keep some factories open. And the reason is that a lot of these items, like the industrial chemicals and the semiconductors, for instance, they're necessary for China to build and make the products that it then exports. So yes, to keep some factories open, that's what they're doing. I don't think they're trying to placate workers as such. Although there are worker protests across China, the regime has been able to control them up to now. So I don't think that, at least now, they're worried. They should be, but I think it's more just to make sure that China can continue to get the components it needs in order to export. With regard to some of the medicines and medical devices, I think those are just that China needs them themselves and they can't get them elsewhere. So that's an attempt, I think, just to make sure that their health system doesn't break down.
What about the protests themselves, though? I mean, it seems like a fairly heavy lift, right, to get decent intelligence on to what degree these protests are having an impact. What scope and scale we're looking at. Have you heard anything related to this? Do they seem to be growing? And if so, are you worried about a fairly serious, aggressive crackdown?
Long term, if we take a long-term perspective, yes, they're growing. Now, even before President Trump took his second oath of office, China's export sector, basically medium and small size factories, a lot of them in the southern portion of the country, were having problems because they weren't having orders. Because they weren't having orders in sufficient quantities, they were not being able to pay workers. And so there were worker protests. And these go back to the beginning of this year. Now, Trump's tariffs and the threat of tariffs have made life much more difficult, and we've seen factories close probably in the thousands. I mean, that's true, but I think that it sort of creates an impression maybe a bit larger than it needs to be, because there are tens of thousands of these small factories. So if they lose 1,000 or two, it is not something which is going to threaten the security of the regime. The one thing about protests that we need to keep our eye on is that in the last few hours, we've been hearing that in Shenzhen, which is the city across from Hong Kong, there was a protest in front of a bank. And that means, I think, to work back. We know that China's small loans and business loans are in trouble. They've been defaulting at an alarming rate. That means probably some of the smaller banks and financial institutions are having problems with liquidity, which means they're probably restricting withdrawals. That would account for the protests in front of the banks. There are also reports, which I think are more speculative, that there are bank protests in Shanghai and Beijing. I'm not sure I believe that, but the point is that those are the rumors that are now circulating. And they come from manufacturing sources, which I think, normally they're pretty good rumor, pretty accurate. So we're getting a picture of not only protests spreading, but also in general, now going to the banking system. That can get critical for China if the central bank doesn't flood the smaller institutions with liquidity, which there are restrictions on what the central bank can do. And so this is going to be the struggle to watch.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting that you say that some of these, the pay issue and the protests there have been building and sort of predate this tariff trade war situation, but that it's obviously certainly adding to it. I've seen some analysis that talks about some 16 million jobs potentially at risk in China. Do you think that's anywhere near accurate?
Yeah, that number comes from the U.S. investment banks, and some foreign investment banks are releasing numbers in that range. You hear 16, you hear 20 million. This is a number which sounds precise, but I'm not so sure. And the reason is it all depends on how the tariff war goes. So if the tariff war goes really badly for China, we're talking well in excess of 20 million jobs. If Trump caves in, then that number is really exaggerated. So we'll find out. And by the way, I don't think Trump will cave, but I do believe that his general instinct to make a deal can sometimes push him into things that are not as advantageous for us as they should be. Remember, we've got all the high cards here right now. We're the trade deficit country. We're the bigger economy. China's economy is probably contracting right now. So Trump doesn't need to cave, especially because this is so critical to our future.
Hey, thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and leave a comment, a really positive, nice, and kind comment. That would be appreciated. And if you're not already subscribed to our channel, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our daily updates.